Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for today's International Association of Facilitators Oceania Group conversation on the future of meetings. It's lovely to have you all with us today. As is customary here in Australia, I'd like to acknowledge as we begin that I'm hosting today's conversation from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of First Nations people and their ongoing cultures and connections to our lands and waters. So today's conversation is about the future of meetings, and I must confess that the more I thought about it after we published this, the more I felt it really needed to be more about the future of meeting, how and why we meet, what we've learned from the last 2 years in particular about what that's like and how it works and doesn't work. And how we as a facilitation community, as gatherers of people and knowledge, can be part of making this experience better for everyone. So it's my absolute pleasure to be bringing this very amazing group of people together for a conversation that I can't wait to have and to share with all of you today about where we can do meetings better, how we can understand meeting and assembling and gathering in new ways, and how we can be a bit more brave to explore some of the frontiers of where technology and new ways of working can mean that these sorts of experiences can be better for all of us. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel to you today. And as I do that, please do take to the chat and introduce yourselves and let us know where you're from too. So firstly, Vanessa Moss is a radio astronomer based at CSIRO, our national science organisation here in Australia, and she works at the boundaries between astronomy, telescope operations and data science. She's a strong advocate of a digital-first approach and for the process of optimising all interactions by maximising accessibility, inclusivity and sustainability. Elizabeth Tasker is an astrophysicist and science communicator at the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, or JAXA. Her research looks at the diversity of extrasolar planets, and she's part of the international outreach teams for the Institute of Space and Aeronautical Science, and also the Hayabusa 2 and MMX missions. And finally, but certainly not by any means least, Viveka Wiley is the engineering and design leader for the program to reinvent science. There is a large undertaking again at CSIRO's Data 61, inventing digital tools to accelerate discovery and knowledge transformation. And his research examines the affordances of place for distributed collaborative creativity. Welcome to all of you. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to our IAF community today. So let's talk about this idea of the future of meetings to kick off. Vanessa, the future of meetings started as a symposium and then has kind of grown from there. Can you share the story of how this came about and give us some insights into the community that this has generated as a result?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alison. And hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have with you all. So yeah, like you said, Alison, it started as a symposium in 2020. We actually were planning it in 2019, so before COVID, and it was motivated by thinking within astronomy, especially how we've always worked as a very distributed field. Our telescopes, they're international. Our collaborations are very international. It's quite rare to have like a local lab that's very inward facing, but we were still traveling a lot. There were sustainability questions, there were accessibility questions. Not everyone was getting the same opportunities. So that was sort of, I guess, where it all started. And we wanted to have a symposium that would bring everyone together to think about this and say, okay, well, this is how we meet now. This is what we do. These are our established practices. Is this what the future should be? And so that was the original symposium in 2020. In fact, that's where I first met Viveka for the first time, even though we were both at CSIRO. And from there, this was an organizing committee, but it actually brought together a really cross-disciplinary, I guess, passionate group of people that really all wanted to see these things change in their fields. And so we wrote a report at the end of 2020. So that kept a bunch of us active to just put out this report. That's on Zenodo. We can share the link after. But after that, a lot of people wanted to know, okay, well, what did we learn from the symposium? What was our advice going forward? So we spent a lot of time advising people, helping them set up events, designing things to be not just online, but also like a good example of online and best practice. And then somewhere along the way in 2021, we're like, okay, well, there's a need for this. We're really interested. We want to do what we can to continue advocating for change. So then we sort of evolved into this community of practice. And so along the way, we also met Elizabeth. So that was at the start of this year, where we helped run a virtual reality event. And then Elizabeth got involved in TFOM. And so I think that's what's really exciting about this, is that the community can grow and develop over time, and also just see change in lots of different places.
So that's really interesting that isn't it interesting that how, conversations and an idea then snowballs in a way as more people start to join and more, perspectives start to be shared. So Elizabeth, from your perspective and from your lens on this as a science communicator and being involved in an organization that almost has collaboration baked into its DNA by necessity, how has this idea of the future of meetings and how we gather differently changed for you, and what's drawn you to this field?
I think perhaps for me, one of the draw was a very, very practical thing, and that is I very much enjoy virtual reality. So before we even talk about how it can be used and how it can really open the door to connecting with a lot more people, at a very fundamental level, I just love it. And I feel that's important, because I feel that many people viewed online collaborations as a compromise. Like, yes, maybe we should do them. I'm sure we'll talk later about accessibility reasons and diversity reasons. But my argument is this is not a compromise. Like, they can be as good, if not better, than in-person meetings for absolutely everyone. And in particular, I enjoy virtual reality very much. I find it incredibly immersive. And I realized this could go a long way beyond just games. For example, I work at JAXA. It's obviously a very big name in Japan, being the National Space Agency. But my campus is not particularly central. It's maybe one to 2 hours outside Tokyo, and it has a small visitor museum. So in all honesty, when people say, oh, I want to visit, I'm like, well, you can, but I'm not really sure it's going to be worth your time or money, if I was strictly honest, especially if you're a tourist in Japan, which we used to have, but apparently we've given up on. It's a bit of a hype. So the question was, therefore, at our institute, we're running these absolutely fantastic space missions. We do robotic space missions to asteroids, to moons, and they're really cutting edge. They're doing some amazing stuff, but then we only have this small museum that's very difficult to visit. So how do you start reaching more people, both in Japan and outside? And of course, the answer to that is online events, but then you don't want any kind of compromise. You want an amazing experience. And things like virtual reality allow you to go, we say, going beyond being there. So, I would say, you want an in-person meeting? Can you hold that on an asteroid? You can't. You can in virtual reality. So the potential of virtual reality, not only to be able to connect with people well beyond my local area, but also to be able to show them something they simply couldn't see in person, has been the big draw to me, to both from the outreach and from the meeting perspective.
I love this idea of going beyond being there. I feel like that needs to be a t-shirt that we all need to have after today's session. And almost becomes a bit of a mantra for all of us to keep in the back of our minds. How do we create that? So Viveka, from your perspective in the reinventing science role that you have, and the kind of the pioneering and frontier sort of dimension, I imagine that involves, what's been your experience around these new ways of collaboration and how we do that more creatively? And what are you seeing around how interaction is evolving and changing?
Yeah, so like segueing on from that, there's a 1997 paper called "Better Than Being There" that people should have a look at. That goes to this point right back. That's when I got into virtual reality, right? VRML 97. I'm that old. And it was terrible, but it was so promising, right? And we're now at a point where it's still terrible, but works. And so so I'm a designer and a technologist. I think that everything's terrible. That's so my job is to try and to figure out how it could be less terrible, how it could be more wonderful. And exactly like there are huge affordances that virtual environments give us. But then there are huge constraints that they impose as well, right? But the affordances are massive and they're different, right? So you've seen the kind of remote attendance at conferences and things is becoming part of the diversity and inclusion budget and process now, right? Because it's shown in practice that it radically opens up the doors to who can attend and how they can attend. You know, I'm involved in a conference called CGRAPH. It's a Computer Graphics and Interactive Technique conference, right? The last conference that was held in Vancouver, there are people from Iran who can't go, right? There are people from, you know, it's, so anyway, so that, you know, thinking about what it opens up to be able to work together, but then how very difficult it can be. Like virtual environments do close us off from so much of the real environments that we need and rely on to, they give us things and they take things away. Like McLuhan said, every extension comes with a corresponding amputation. And so, but we can think about, so my job is to think about how to change that, how to get the best of both worlds, and mixed reality systems, augmented reality. Augmented reality, you've all seen and heard about. Mixed reality is a broader idea that can give us the affordances of places, you know, where my research goes, and while also bridging distance and giving us the you know, the imaginative possibilities of So, but one other point I would make is if you look at all the lots and lots of work, like from in this field of distributed meetings and systems for them, and whether it's in VR or even the system that we, like right now I'm looking at Zoom, right? In 1984, this approach, this what we call the Brady Bunch layout, was experimentally shown to be the worst layout that you could choose to create a sense of companionship and creativity in the workplace.
Well done us
work,
then.
right? Yeah. But we're, you know, there are better ways, you know, so think about how these systems are, right? And how wonderfully useful they are already, and then realize that they're designed about as badly as they could be and where we could go from here.
All right, well, with that baseline, thanks, Vivica. But I mean, it's a really interesting point though, isn't it? That we do, just simply by virtue of the tools that become the norm, because that's what everybody's using, we learn to accept what is available as opposed to then exploring what might be possible and going to this idea of imagining what an alternative might be. Vanessa, you and I have had a number of passionate conversations, and we've worked together a couple of times on some brave new world, well, possibly not by Vivica's standards, but some brave new world experiences for people that is a little bit more beyond this conventional video conferencing style approach. But one of the things that we inevitably bump up against is, you know, the human dynamic dimension of, you know, people being resistant to try something new, adults in particular not wanting to be seen to fail at something new and being a little bit unwilling to try and experiment. What's been some of your observations of that, and some tips perhaps you could share about how we, as, you know, people who advise others on how to craft these experiences, how we overcome some of those barriers to try a different format or a different platform that might actually provide a much more beautiful and involving experience than it might otherwise?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And it's something we definitely see a lot of. Like, we've realized over time that it's very rarely that the technology isn't out there to do something that needs to be done online, but it's how you use it, and it's how you sort of, I guess, socialize it in the community. And so I think one thing that we have seen is quite important is, you probably see this as well a lot in facilitation, is that people vote with their feet, and they vote with their feet even more online because it's so easy not to turn up. Like if you look at the sort of participation rates or sign up rates in person versus online. So one of the things we talked about, okay, like, you know, do you charge for things? Does that give people more investment? But we found one of the most important things is just really investing in the value that's being offered to people. And so making it very clear. So for example, this goes especially to when you're trying something new or different. It's like, okay, we're going to use this new platform. Let's take, I don't know, Gather as an example, which is like, it's like video calls, and it's not very different to Zoom, but it gives you spatial autonomy. These little characters move around. There's a few clones of it as well. So we're going to use Gather. that can scare people right away because they're like, oh, but Zoom just works or WebEx just works. So it's not enough to just send a link and say, come in. It's like, okay, this is why we're using it, explain this tool does this, and it offers us this value, which is going to make our online experience better for these reasons. So I think really kind of that value proposition for people, it's something that we're still figuring out in TFOM as well. Like, how do you convince people that it's worth that uncomfortableness of doing something new or different or risky because of the value they might get? And so one of the other things we do a lot in TFOM is we try to, I guess, minimize the risk for people. So we try to do demonstrative events where we use something like virtual reality technology. We do all of the technical side and we ask people to join us, and they can join in different tiers. So maybe they're in a VR headset, maybe they're in a desktop platform that's in the VR platform, maybe they're watching a live stream, but that sort of exposes them to some of the experience. So yeah, it's really hard. I'm really interested to hear from the facilitator community, because I think you might have some really interesting insights that we haven't even figured out yet. But yeah, maybe Elizabeth and Viveka want to comment as well.
Actually, Elizabeth, I see you nodding vigorously at everything that Vanessa's saying there. But I was interested to hear the comments that you were just making earlier around how you find, VR being really immersive and really valuable. And I think most of us, and again, probably showing my age a little bit here, to Viveka's point of, it's always kind of seemed clunky or something that belongs in Ready Player One and not really for us kind of civilians, as it were. Talk to us a little bit about what it's like to firstly experience that, but also to lead others to experience something like that.
So I would say, first of all, let's just bust a couple of myths about VR, because I think people they're not really myths, they're legacy myths, they're just not true anymore. The first is that to join a virtual reality event, like the ones that we run at TFOM, you must have a virtual reality headset. That isn't true. As Vanessa's pointed out, we have cross-platform compatibility. So you can join from your Mac or Windows PC. I've even seen people join through Linux, but I think they were very clever coders to get that working. But most of these platforms, they do allow desktop access. Now, it's not as immersive, but it is still very good. So, don't be put off if you haven't got a VR headset. If you just like to try it, just try it from your laptop. It's fine. The second thing is, if you do want a VR headset, and I would thoroughly recommend that, you no longer need to buy, something very expensive. Because I've been interested in VR for years, but I've been hesitating about buying a headset because I was a Mac user, and Mac have never really supported the GPU community. So if I wanted to get into VR only a few years ago, I would have needed to buy a high-end gaming PC and then the headset. I mean, you're looking at dropping, what currency do I want to use? Thousands in what the currency of your choice that isn't yen. It's very expensive. So I hesitated because I was like, well, I'm really interested, but what if I didn't like it? That's a lot of money to spend. But nowadays that isn't true. Something like the MetaQuest headsets, I have the MetaQuest 2, it's completely standalone. You don't need any kind of PC or Mac linked to it. It just sits on your head as a complete unit. And the price for that now, I think, is about 600 Australian dollars. And that's actually gone up slightly because apparently there's a big parts shortage at the moment. So all gaming consoles have been a bit more expensive lately. So it's even the upper end. And in the next year, several different headsets are going to appear. So the competition is going to increase for that kind of standalone headset. And this is genuinely powerful. I mean, sure, you can get more power if you link it up to a high-end GPU, but you haven't got a second-rate headset in your head anymore with a standalone. You can join all these events, you can play any game you like. It's really good. So the first two things I would say is the entry barrier is much, much lower than you think it is and has been in the past. And in terms of why I like it so much, I think the biggest example is when I go to a VR event, say I go to one of our TFOM events, or sometimes I just meet up with my friends, including Vanessa, and we play golf. It feels like I've gone somewhere. Like, I love talking to my friends on Zoom. I talk to my parents on FaceTime every week, and it's lovely. But I don't ever feel I've left my apartment. When I put on a VR headset, the memory I make is indistinguishable from having gone somewhere and sat down and had a cup of coffee with someone. I feel like I've really gone to a different location. And I find it really exciting because it isn't just Starbucks. It's, playing golf on the mountain tops of China or somewhere like that. It's like it's really different and it's really immersive. So I think I would say if you're sort of interested in VR, you can join many events from your desktop. So straight away, you don't have to pay any money. And if you're interested, the buy-in is not nearly as expensive as you think. It's about the same as a game console. And I think it will really give you a sense of having gone somewhere and gone somewhere that you could never go in real life as well. So I think that's why I like it so much.
So Viveka, just building on that, this idea of, being transported, I'm interested in your responses to this, particularly given your comments a little earlier about this issue of, diversity and equity and creating opportunities for people to participate rather than barriers. Can you expand on that idea a little?
Yeah, so the price point that we're at now, about $600 for a headset, right, it's within, if you're facilitating something and you've got a budget to run an event, it's within your diversity and inclusion budget, quite possibly, to send people headsets. Maybe not everyone who's participating, right? It's a high-end conference. You could actually, like I'm sure we all have attended some conferences where you can, the ticket price could cover one. Particularly if it suddenly had to go remote and you don't need a venue anymore, right? But but even without that, if you just think about, if people are applying for grants to attend and things like that, you can fit in sending them a headset within the budget. And as Elizabeth and Vanessa were saying, it's not you can do video feeds and things like that, which lower the barrier to entry. And also, like, not just technologically, but psychologically. And when Vanessa was talking about this before, it reminded me of, I do human factors research in computing, but I steal a lot of my best ideas from early childhood and education research. And there's a common pattern in play, and because this is, this interaction and creativity is a form of play. But in play with children, where the less confident kids will stay on, the kids who are joining a play group, for example, and haven't before, you probably observed this yourself in life, right? They'll hang back and just watch, maybe for weeks, and learn by watching, and be quiet and just observe how learn the rules of the game. And then as they feel confident, they join in. And so, that pattern that Vanessa described, I think we can support that.
So Vanessa, one of the things I guess that as a facilitator community, and I'm sure anybody who is arranging any kind of gathering at the moment is grappling with constantly, is this idea of hybrid or blended or any variation on, that kind of language, but also this idea of how we can be better and more effective at using synchronous and asynchronous modes of interaction. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this idea of hybrid, because even within our own, group, every time, someone suggests a hybrid event, the first reaction is, oh, like that, like the complexity of that, it just feels like you immediately, even for those of us that do this for a living, there's immediate barriers that come up, which we need to be able to get past. What are some of your thoughts on how we grapple with that, and how we perhaps step forward and see hybrid or blended and asynchronous versus synchronous as being opportunities rather than inhibitors?
Yeah, it's a good thing. It's a good question. I feel like, I guess the first thing is that hybrid, there's no real best practice for it yet. It's something that's still evolving, and it's somewhere where I think every experiment we do in the community, everything we learn from it and like put back in for next time, is something that contributes to how that evolves. And that's true of online as well. And I would say in person. I feel like it's been a century since we've really stepped back and said, like, is what we do in person best practice. So that's one of the exciting things about now, I guess, is that we can rethink all that. With hybrid, I guess, so one of the things we did in TFOM originally was, so that was online only, but it was exploring all the kinds of modes in which we meet, why we use certain modes for different things, what is in person really good for, is it 90% passive content sitting in a hall silently, or is it interactions? If you ask most people that go to an event, like, why does it need to be in person? Inevitably, they'll say, oh, you know, organic interaction, serendipitous stuff, meeting people. But that's actually not how we design our events. So I think that's probably, you know, when we're trying to seek this definition of what good hybrid looks like, we should also rethink in person as well. Like, what is online best for? When do we use hybrid? When do we use in person? So one of the things that I guess came out of the original TFOM exploration that we did was that we sort of came up with this concept of digital. Well, we didn't like invent digital first, but we kind of emphasized it. We're like, yes, we support this concept. And people have different words for this. Like in work context, it's often like remote first, or, you know, location agnostic, that sort of stuff. And what it basically means is that when you're designing the event, especially hybrid, you sort of abstract away the location. So it's not about this thing happening in Brisbane and people are dialing into it. It's this thing is happening in a virtual setting and Brisbane is connecting to it and Sydney's connecting to it and maybe Madrid is connecting to it, and everyone's connecting to something that doesn't have a physical location. And so we found when you think about events that way, it can actually help a lot, because it means if the venue suddenly isn't available, it doesn't matter because your virtual setup's fine. If a speaker was in person and switches to online, it doesn't matter because the connection, you know, I mean, it just sort of makes a lot of that easier. And I think, Alison, you mentioned we worked together, like when we did science pathways with the Academy, I think that was kind of part of the planning too, was just trying to make the hybrid so that the experience for the participants was as similar as possible, regardless if they were in person or online. So that's, you know, so like bringing that experience together. And then also trying to, get rid of that in-person dominance. So I guess digital first would be one of the key things. Trying to use technology.
Kind of build that in rather than seeing it as a like an after add-on or something that you have to cope with, rather than it being a core part of, you know, what it is that you're doing. Elizabeth, I'm interested in exploring this idea of, you know, digital first, and particularly this idea too of working synchronously and asynchronously, particularly when you're looking at collaboration, potentially over long periods of time, over different time zones, over different cadences in a particular program of work. How have you found that being more innovative in how you connect with people has made that work better? What are some of the things that we can learn perhaps from you and your colleagues, and how you're trialing and testing ways that you can collaborate in new ways?
Sorry, struggling with an answer. I would say that Vanessa's point about hybrid is difficult. I think the digital first, I would sort of reiterate that point. So for instance, I recently attended Communicating Astronomy for the Public conference, which was based in Sydney, but I attended remotely from Tokyo. And it was super easy to connect with everyone else who was remote, because we use Kumo space, which is a bit like Gather, where again, you have like 2D space, you have a little avatar and you can move around. But the in-person conference never went onto Kumo space. So you basically had two conferences that were listening to the same talks, which was not bad. Like, you know, it was not a failure. I enjoyed the conference. I had a good time. But every time I wanted to cross over that divide, I definitely struggled because I basically had to email someone, because I had no method of bumping into them when they weren't virtual. So I would say that one of the ways to get around that is exactly what Vanessa said, this whole digital first. And so you put everyone online to a certain degree. So for example, even before COVID happened, and so we were all meeting in person, we used something called Slido for questions. And you can use this from your laptop or your phone. And it's great, because even in an in-person meeting, everyone can enter questions during a talk. So they don't have to wait to remember to the end. And then they can be upvoted. So if you have the same question as someone else, rather than putting up your hand and then someone else asking it, you can just upvote their question on Slido. And so it gets more likely to be asked. So this was something we were doing well before hybrid became a big discussion point. And yet it works perfectly for a hybrid conference, because everyone's on exactly the same footing with asking questions. So I would say tools like that, there's some examples, but more should be developed to try and cross that bridge between the in-person and the hybrid meeting.
Viveka, with your kind of digital and kind of technology hat on, then if we're kind of thinking digital first, what would be some of your recommendations from things that you've seen work well and things that you've seen haven't worked well, that those of us who are going to embark on designing a meeting, a gathering, a conference, whatever it might be, that are almost kind of the top 3 or 5 things that we should be thinking about in how we can best make that digital first experience as good as we possibly can?
So yeah, I completely concur with what Vanessa and Elizabeth said about digital first. I would think of it differently as, I might phrase it differently. You're always in a play, it's happening somewhere. And that somewhere should be the place that everyone can access. So that means you're creating a place, right? And you should take that seriously. So think about what that means and what technologies can support the creation of that shared place. So, and if you think about the word place and the difference between things like space and location, right? Location is, somewhere on the earth or in certain coordinates. A place, a space is empty and open and full of possibilities. A place is a space with a history, right? A place is somewhere that you've learned something or done something with somebody else, and it has persistence, right? So if you think about what you want to do and make sure you choose technologies that support those things, like support not just going to a virtual meet. Like, think there's often a kind of a pattern that people do. They'll say, okay, well, we're going to have a virtual meeting. We'll have it in a virtual meeting room. It should look, it should be like a boardroom, and you sit around a boardroom table. But you think, would we really have this in a boardroom, this meeting? Like, boardrooms have particular affordances and constraints, right? They're for sitting and listening and agreeing and conforming. That's what they're for, and that's what they do. Right? It's like a screen at the end of a room with, and like they're designed to do a thing, and they do that thing really well. They converge people's minds. So think about, what kind of place do we want? And not just what does it look like, but what does it support? So if you want people to be able to think together and create together, you've got to find a tool that gives them the capability to write to the space in some way, and maybe leave things in the space so they're back there, and maybe come back to it another time. That's one of the wonderful things, is that we have infinite real estate. Right? You can make a room and you can say, this is the room that we created for this event, and we were all there together and we learned something and something happened, and it's still there. You can come back to it, and it can be a persistent place. That's one of the things that TFOM does quite beautifully, I think.
That's really interesting, the idea of it being persistent. Yeah. And what also resonates, Vivica, with what you're saying there too, is that quite often, one of the tenets, I guess, of the work that we do as facilitators is that we talk about that we're there to hold the space. And there's always, certainly when I use it, I mean it in a relatively abstract way, as opposed to, but also, in a physical space, it means something else. But I guess listening to you, what I'm challenge my colleagues to think about is to recalibrate what we mean by space and how we hold that and how we invite people into that and help them make it their space as well. So that's really interesting. So I'm going to pause our panel conversation now, because I want to make sure that all the lovely people who have joined us get a chance to ask questions and to dig into some of these issues with each of our panel contributors in more detail. So I'm going to give us around about 20 minutes to have a conversation. I'm sending one of the panel into each of the rooms. You'll get to meet each other. You'll get to meet the panel. And I'm going to put into the chat just a couple of questions that you might want to use as discussion starters, although I suspect you don't need those. I can imagine that all of these questions are bouncing around in your heads already. So I hope that you get a chance to have a conversation, and I'll bring you back in around 20 minutes time, and we'll see what some of the big ideas or the new challenges are. So I'm just going to open the rooms now, and we'll see you back shortly. Welcome back. Just waiting for a couple of the other rooms who are just waiting till the final second for the Zoom whiplash to fling them back into general population with the rest of us. I don't know about you folks, but I have feelings about the breakout room capability that is both love and hate in equal measures. I love that it brings everybody back and I don't have to go wrangle people, but at the same time, I hate that it cuts you off halfway through a sentence. So apologies, but hopefully that was an energizing and interesting, perhaps challenging conversation. And I hope that you got a chance to really explore some new ideas and some new thoughts. So I'm going to invite Elizabeth, Vanessa and Vivica to share one final thought with us before we finish for today. But I'd also like to give each of you an opportunity to meet a challenge. So we're going to do one chat box storm to close out today's session. So I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes before I invite Elizabeth, Vanessa and Vivica to chat with us again briefly. I'd like you to take to the chat. And I'd like you to share what's one thing you're going to try differently as a result of this session. But the trick is don't press send. We're all going to press send at the same time, and we're going to get this wave of commitment coming at us in real time. So have a think about what's one thing you're going to do differently. Type it into the chat, but don't hit send yet. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Find. Okay, so while you're putting the finishing touches on your promise to yourself, I'm going to ask Vanessa and then Elizabeth and then Vivica. So Vanessa, to you first. If you could leave this community with one thought, with one suggestion, one invitation, what would it be?
It's hard. I have to go first. Okay. So mine will be, I guess, this sort of new era that we find ourselves in. It can be a little scary. Like technology can seem scary, change can seem scary, but it's actually an opportunity. Like it's one of the big chances we have to look back at everything we took for granted as established and say, is this right or can we do better? So for me, that's super exciting. It's why we do what we do in TFOM. And I guess as TFOM, we're here to help in whatever way we can with this community to help that technology seem less scary. So please reach out, please continue the conversation. We'd love to chat more and see how we can help each other. So that's probably my key message.
Elizabeth, did she steal your thunder?
Not quite. So I think I will I'll just add to that and say that tools like virtual reality and other similar ones, they're not a magic wand. They can't be waved and everything will work perfectly and you'll have the most perfect hybrid meeting. But they have huge amounts of potential. And I think it's really worth looking at these tools and developing them and getting used to them and encouraging their use, because actually they offer a solution for online that's without compromise and could really take us somewhere amazing. And I think it's worth pursuing that.
Brilliant. And Vivica, final word to you. What's your challenge or your invitation to this group?
So I would like everyone to notice, I think, what you're already noticing, which is that something's happening here, right? There's an inflection point in what is possible and what we're capable of. And we're in an explosion of possibilities. So I would encourage you to explore many, many different tools. It isn't a settled fixed thing at the moment. It's that Cambrian explosion is happening right now. Explore many things and encourage the groups that you work with and your institutions to think of this as an exploratory time as well. To say it's time, don't worry that you can't settle on something. I know with email and video conferencing, this is not that. This is a new thing. It's a time to explore and try things and set up programs to try things and spend that time and figure it out together.
Wonderful. So to all of you now, I'd invite you to hit send and share the thing that you're going to do differently as a result of today. Here they all come. How brilliant. I love doing this. It gives me a great thrill. It doesn't matter the question. It's always wonderful. So I'd also invite you just to scroll up and have a bit of a wander through some of the things that people are going to try. A few people are committing to try VR. Got a few people committing to try VR. That's great. Designing, exploring new tools like Gather, watching people play. Again, this observing, watching, learning. Wonderful. So thank you so much to Elizabeth, to Vanessa and Vivica for sharing your experiences and your confidence with us. It was tremendous to be able to talk with you. Just a reminder to everybody here that the Future of Meetings has a website, which I'll pop into the chat. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Vanessa. And they are doing a really interesting series at the moment called the Science for the Public Good and the Future of Meetings Together. Could be a really interesting way to dip your toe in the water and try some of these new experiences in a space that we aren't responsible for running. So join someone else's space and learn something. It's always fun. So I'd invite you to explore that and make contact with Vanessa, with Vivica and Elizabeth to keep this conversation going. One final thing from me before we go is that stay tuned for our session next month, which sort of steps off from where we finished today. And we're going to look even further into the future. We're going to look at facilitation and AI and where that brave new world is headed. So if that's something of interest to you, we will be sending out details about that. That'll be in the 3rd week of October. So until then, we look forward to seeing you next time around. Thank you again to our guests and to all of you for joining. For those of you that came partway through, we did record today's session, so you'll be able to re-enjoy it at your leisure. And we look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye for now.